In the remote village of Knoxwood, nestled deep within the ancient forest, a dark legend persisted, whispered among the villagers with both dread and fascination. The legend spoke of a pack of werewolves known as the Shadowborn, creatures so malevolent that they were said to thrive on the very last breath of their victims. The Shadowborn were not the typical werewolves of folklore. They were ancient, predating most modern tales, and their presence was marked by an eerie, unnatural chill that seemed to seep into the very fabric of reality. Their fur was as dark as a moonless night, and their eyes glowed with a malevolent light that could pierce through the darkest shadows. They were not merely predators, they were torturers, savoring the agony of their prey before delivering the final, fatal blow. Legend had it that the Shadowborn were cursed by a witch centuries ago. Their transformation was no ordinary curse. They became creatures of pure malevolence, bound by a need to drain the life force of others to prolong their own twisted existence. It was said that they could only be sated when their victims' breaths slowed to a whisper, and their souls hovered at the brink of death. In the dead of night, the villagers would lock their doors and windows, whispering prayers to ward off the evil that prowled outside. Yet, despite their precautions, the Shadowborn were relentless. Their hunting ground was the forest surrounding Knoxwood, where they would lurk among the trees, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One fateful evening, a young woman named Alara ventured into the forest, driven by a desperate search for her missing brother. As she delved deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and an oppressive silence fell. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees casting long, sinister shadows. Alara's flashlight flickered, casting eerie patterns on the ground. She could feel eyes upon her, and her heart pounded with a mix of fear and determination. Suddenly, she heard a low growl, and her breath caught in her throat. She turned to see a pair of glowing eyes emerging from the darkness. Before she could react, the Shadowborn were upon her. Their movements were swift and silent, almost as if they were part of the very darkness itself. They surrounded her, their eyes reflecting a chilling hunger. Alara's scream was swallowed by the forest as the Shadowborn closed in, their cruel anticipation evident in their eyes. As the night stretched on, Alara's struggle became a mere whisper against the suffocating silence of the forest. The Shadowborn, with their insatiable hunger, relished every moment of her terror. Their twisted forms danced in the shadows, a macabre ballet of death. The next morning, the villagers found Alara's flashlight lying in the forest, its beam pointing to a single, empty spot where she had last been seen. There was no trace of her, only the lingering chill that hinted at the presence of something far more sinister. The Shadowborn remained a haunting mystery, their malevolence unending. In the village of Knoxwood, the tale of the evil werewolves continued to be told, each retelling adding to the chilling legacy of the creatures who survived on the last breath of their victims. The forest remained as dark and foreboding as ever, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurked within. And as long as the Shadowborn prowled the woods, the intrigue of their cruel existence would remain unresolved, their story continuing in the whispered fears of those who dared to tread too close to the darkness. The village of Knoxwood was never the same after Alara vanished. Her disappearance became another grim tale in the already long history of the village's tragedies. But for those who knew her best, the story wasn't over. Weeks passed, and as autumn settled in, the villagers noticed something peculiar. The nights grew colder than usual, but it wasn't just the chill of the season. It was something more unsettling, as if the forest itself had absorbed the malevolence of the Shadowborn. The winds that howled through the trees carried whispers, and some claimed to hear Alara's voice, faint but desperate, calling for help. Among those who refused to believe Alara was gone was her closest friend, Merrick. He had known Alara since childhood, and the thought of her being lost to the forest, taken by the monstrous werewolves, gnawed at his mind. Driven by guilt for not stopping her from entering the woods, he became obsessed with finding the truth about what happened that night. One evening, Merrick, armed with a battered journal he'd found in the village archives, discovered a passage that shook him to the core. It spoke of an ancient ritual, one that the villagers had long forgotten. According to the journal, the curse of the Shadowborn wasn't merely an affliction of bloodlust. The werewolves weren't born of normal means, they were bound to the very souls they hunted. Each victim they consumed didn't die immediately. Instead, their life force became trapped within the pack, their final breath lingering, their spirits caught in an eternal struggle between life and death. Merrick realized what the whispers on the wine truly were. They were the voices of the trapped souls, unable to move on, tormented by the agony of their last moments. Alara's voice was among them, calling out from the edge of existence, lingering just beyond the veil. Determined to free her, Merrick began his own journey into the forest, retracing her steps. As night fell, the same chilling silence swallowed him. But unlike the others who had ventured into the woods and never returned, Merrick had something they didn't plan. The journal mentioned a way to disrupt the Shadowburn's connection to their victims. It required confronting the pack leader, a creature of unimaginable power and cruelty. With each step deeper into the forest, Merrick felt the eyes upon him, just as Alara had. He whispered her name into the dark, hoping beyond hope that she could hear him. The air grew colder, the trees casting even darker shadows, as if the forest itself was conspiring against him. And then, he saw them. The glowing eyes, first one pair, then another, emerging from the blackness between the trees. But this time, something was different. Among the pack was a figure Merrick recognized, though twisted and transformed. It was Alara, or what remained of her. Her skin was pale, her eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the werewolves. She had been taken, her soul tethered to the pack, but her body was no longer her own. Marek's heart sank. The Shadowburn had turned her into one of their own. But even as he stood frozen in horror, Alara's lips parted, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Help me." The other wolves snarled, their breath visible in the cold night air, but they didn't move. They waited, watching him with an almost predatory patience. Marek's hand tightened around the ritual dagger he had brought, his only hope of severing the bond that held Alara captive. But as he took a step toward her, the pack leader emerged from the shadows, a towering, nightmarish figure. Its fur was black as midnight, its eyes burning with an ancient malevolence. It moved with a lethal grace, circling Merrick slowly, as if daring him to try and break the curse. "You cannot save her," the creature hissed, its voice echoing in Marek's mind. "She is ours now. She is bound to us, as you will be." Marek's resolve faltered, but Alara's eyes, though transformed, still held a flicker of her former self. She was not entirely lost, not yet. As the pack leader lunged toward him, Merrick dodged, thrusting the dagger forward. The blade glowed with an unnatural light as it pierced the creature's skin, and for a moment, the air crackled with energy. The wolves howled in agony, their forms flickering like shadows in a storm. Alara collapsed to the ground, clutching her chest, gasping for breath. But the ritual wasn't complete. The pack leader staggered, wounded but not defeated, its snarling face twisted with rage. Merrick could see the pack reforming, their shadows solidifying once more. The leader's voice, now a deep, guttural growl, filled the night. "You have only delayed the inevitable." Merrick rushed to Alara's side, helping her to her feet. She was weak, barely able to stand, but her eyes were clear. She was herself again, at least for now. "We have to go," she gasped, her voice trembling. "But this isn't over. They will come for us." Merrick nodded, knowing the truth of her words. The Shadowburn were far from defeated. The pack's power was tied to something much darker, something older than either of them could imagine. As they fled the forest, the chilling howls of the Shadowburn echoed behind them, growing fainter as they reached the village's edge. But Merrick knew the peace was only temporary. The werewolves would return, hungrier and angrier than before. And now, they had a new target: him. The night held its breath, and in the distance, the eyes of the forest watched, waiting for the hunt to begin again. The pack was not finished. Merrick and Alara made it back to the village, but there was no relief in their survival. The villagers sensed something was wrong. The air around them felt heavier, as though the malevolence of the forest had followed them back. That night, Merrick sat by the fire in his home, the weight of everything crashing down on him. Alara rested in the corner, her breath shallow, still weak from the ordeal. Her transformation back to human had taken its toll, but Merrick couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unfinished. He could still hear the distant howls of the Shadowburn, creeping through the night air like a death song. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed through the room. Merrick froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached for the dagger, knowing deep down that the Shadowburn wouldn't be so bold as to walk through the village. But when the door creaked open, it wasn't one of the villagers. It was something else. Alara's eyes snapped open, her body seizing up as if she were being choked by an invisible force. Her skin turned deathly pale, her breath quickening, and her once clear eyes filled with a familiar glow, the glow of the pack. They're inside me, she gasped, clawing at her chest, her nails drawing blood. Merrick, they never left. Before he could react, Alara's body convulsed violently, and her form began to twist in horrifying ways. The bones in her arms and legs cracked, reshaping themselves as her skin split open. The fur of the Shadowburn began to push through, her transformation accelerating at a brutal speed. Alara! No! Merrick shouted, but it was too late. She let out a shriek, a sound filled with unbearable pain as her body became something monstrous again, a grotesque hybrid of human and werewolf. Her eyes met Marek's for a fleeting moment, filled with agony and fear, and then, the humanity was gone. She lunged at him, her claws slashing through the air. Merrick barely managed to dodge her attack, stumbling backward into the table. The dagger slipped from his hand, clattering uselessly to the floor. Alara, or what had become of her, snarled, her fangs dripping with saliva, as she prepared for another strike. Merrick grabbed a chair and swung it at her with all his strength, but it shattered uselessly against her transformed body. She was unstoppable now, her power far beyond anything he had faced in the forest. The Shadowburn had claimed her fully, using her body as a puppet for their relentless hunger. In a final desperate move, Merrick dove for the dagger. His fingers wrapped around the hilt just as Alara pounced. He rolled onto his back and thrust the blade upward, plunging it into her chest. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Alara's body convulsed, the blade sinking deep into her heart. Her glowing eyes dimmed, and her breath came in ragged gasps. For a second, Merrick thought he had saved her, that he had finally broken the curse. But then, the air around them grew deathly cold, and he realized the terrible truth. Alara's lips curled into a twisted smile, blood dripping from her mouth. Her voice, now a guttural growl, sent chills down his spine. You can't stop us. With her last breath, the curse completed itself. The room exploded in chaos as the walls groaned, shadows lengthened, and the air seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The entire village echoed with the same unnatural howl. Marek's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. Alara had been a vessel, a conduit for something far worse. The Shadowburn weren't bound to just her soul anymore, they had latched onto him too. The curse had jumped, spreading through the village, unseen, like a poison in the air. Suddenly, a deafening crash came from outside. The howls multiplied. The village's walls couldn't protect them any longer. The pack was here, and they were no longer just lurking in the woods. Merrick stumbled to the door, throwing it open just in time to see the dark, twisted shapes of the Shadowburn descending upon Knoxwood. They tore through the village, their glowing eyes flickering like torches in the night. Houses burned, screams filled the air, and blood stained the ground. Behind him, Merrick could hear Alara rising again. The ritual dagger hadn't saved her, it had only anchored her to the Shadowburn's will. You will be ours, she growled, her voice now fully consumed by the pack's hunger. She lunged at him once more, faster and stronger than before. Merrick didn't even have time to scream before her claws ripped through his chest, tearing his heart from his body. He collapsed to the ground, his blood pooling beneath him as his last breath escaped into the freezing night. As the life drained from him, the last thing he saw was the village burning, and the Shadowburn tearing apart everyone in their path. Knoxwood would fall, consumed by the curse that had started centuries ago. The werewolves had claimed their final victims, and now they would spread beyond the forest, unstoppable in their bloodlust. The curse was complete. Knoxwood was no more, and the Shadowburn's hunt would continue, far beyond the cursed village.